Tune in for a tale, words that set sail.
Digital Splendor, Literature Illuminated.
You know, when the French Revolution kicked off, it did way more than just topple a monarchy. It sparked one of the biggest intellectual battles in history. We're talking about a war of words between two guys who used to be friends, and their fight, it pretty much defined modern politics as we know it. All right, so let's set the stage. In one corner, you've got Edmund Burke. He was a famous statesman, a real champion of tradition, inherited rights, the wisdom of our ancestors. And in the other corner, Thomas Paine, a total revolutionary. His whole argument was that nothing, not a king, not a parliament, not even tradition, should get in the way of the natural rights of people who are alive right now. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with how these two friends became enemies. Then we'll dive into their biggest fights, the living versus the dead, whether it's about principles or persons, what a constitution actually is, and finally, we'll get to the heart of it all, the rights of man. So believe it or not, before this whole thing blew up, Burke and Paine were friends. I mean, Burke even had Paine over to his house. But then, in 1790, everything changed. Burke publishes this pamphlet, Reflections on the Revolution in France, and it is just a scathing attack on what was happening. For Paine, this was a line in the sand. He saw it as a betrayal of everything liberty stood for, and he just couldn't let it slide. Paine, who was actually in Paris at the time, saw Burke's work as, and I quote, an outrageous abuse. He thought it was just full of flagrant misrepresentations, so he felt he had a duty to respond. And that response? It became his masterpiece, Rights of Man. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some book. It was a direct, point-by-point takedown aimed squarely at his old friend. Okay, so this gets us to the absolute core of their disagreement. It all boils down to one huge question. Where does political power really come from? Does it come from the decisions made by people who are long dead and gone? Or does it come from the will of the people who are alive right here, right now? Burke's argument was completely rooted in the past. He points back to the English Revolution of 1688, where Parliament basically declared that they and all their descendants would submit to the crown forever. For Burke, this wasn't just an old law. It was a sacred, unbreakable promise. And Paine's comeback? Oh, it was just absolutely electric. He said that this idea, the vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave, was, and I love this phrase, the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. For him, the idea that one generation could tie the hands of the next was just outrageous. And this really gets to his central point, right? For Paine, no parliament, no past generation has the right to decide how the world is governed forever. He believed that every single generation has to be free to act for itself. The dead, in his view, have absolutely no claim over the freedom of the living. So you can see how this huge disagreement in philosophy plays out in how they saw the French Revolution itself. Burke looked at it and saw this bloody, personal attack on the king and queen. But Paine saw something way, way bigger going on. Right, so Burke is over here complaining that the French rebelled against what he called a mild monarch. He saw it as a crime against a person, but Paine's response was basically, you're totally missing the point. He argued the French weren't rising up against the man, Louis XVI. They were revolting against the principle of monarchy itself, this system of inherited tyranny that had been crushing France for centuries. So let's ask the big question that really split these two thinkers. Was the revolution really against the king? Paine's answer was a hard no. He even admitted that, Louis XVI was probably more moderate than the kings before him. But, and this is key, that didn't matter. He wrote that a casual discontinuance of the practice of despotism is not a discontinuance of its principles. In other words, a nicer tyrant is still a tyrant. The whole system had to go. And what's so fascinating is how Paine saw this system. He said it wasn't just one big despotism coming from the king. No, it was 1,000 despotisms that had popped up everywhere. In the monarchy, sure, but also in the church, in the courts, in local feudal power. It was like this endless maze of tyranny that had to be ripped out by the roots. But see, Paine wasn't just about tearing things down. He was about building something new. And his next target was the very foundation of the government his old friend Burke loved so much, the English Constitution. And this led to Paine's ultimate challenge. It's brilliant. He basically turns to Burke and all of England and asks this super simple question. You guys talk all the time about your constitution. Okay, can you show it to me? Can you produce the English Constitution? And his own answer was just stunning. He said, it doesn't exist. He argued that just having a bunch of laws and traditions that a government made up over the years, well, that's not a constitution. For Paine, a real constitution had to be something completely different. So what is a constitution, according to Paine? It's simple. First, it has to come before the government. It's the act of the people creating the government, not the other way around. And second, it has to be a real physical thing, a document you can point to, article by article, and say, this is where the power comes from, period. And this brings us right to the heart of his whole philosophy, the very title of his famous work. For Paine, a just government isn't built on dusty old traditions or raw power. It's built on a crystal clear understanding of human rights. He makes this really brilliant distinction. He says we have natural rights just because we exist. You know, the right to think, to believe what you want, to act for your own happiness. Then there are civil rights, things like security and protection, that we get from being part of a society. But here's the kicker. Civil rights aren't handed down to us by a government. They grow directly out of our natural rights. So how does that happen? He calls it a social compact. But wait, this isn't some deal between the people and a king. Paine's idea was way more radical. He said it's a compact that we, as individuals, make with each other to create a government. The power flows up from the people, not down from a ruler. And here's a great example of how it works. Let's say you have a natural right to judge your own case if someone wrongs you. But your individual power to actually enforce that right is, well, it's pretty weak. So what you do is you deposit that right into what he calls the common stock of society. And in return, society gives you its collective power to protect that right for you. See? You don't give up your rights. You just trade your weak individual power for the strong collective power of everyone. The impact of this whole intellectual duel was just massive. I mean, in arguing about the French Revolution, Burke and Paine didn't just write a couple of pamphlets. They basically laid out the fundamental arguments that would define our entire political world for the next 200 years. Think about it. Burke, with his defense of tradition, established institutions, and slow, gradual change, well, he's now seen as the father of modern conservatism. And Paine, with his fiery belief in reason, revolution, and the rights of every single person, he became the champion of modern liberalism and republicanism. Their arguments are still the foundation of the left-right divide today. And so their epic debate just keeps echoing through time. Seriously, every time we argue about change versus tradition, or individual rights versus the stability of the group, we are basically refighting the duel between Paine and Burke. Their central question, who should have the power, the dead or the living, is something we are still trying to answer. The only real question left is, who do you think is winning today?